Of course, we know that education is crucial today. And looking at the trend, that more and more students today across the nations are very much interested in getting degree in a law school. And keep in mind that this is not just about a career path, it's more about the personal ambitions and drive. But recently, if you notice, a lot of law schools within the States are facing some major financial difficulties and also some political reason related too. Now, recently, an article came across my desk and it says, "Is your law school going broke?" How do we understand that, and what are the major hurdles for the law school at this moment? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished guest, Professor Paul Campos. Professor Campos left a position with a Chicago law firm to begin his teaching career at Colorado Law School in 1990. As a scholar, he is focused on constitutional law and legal theory. His graduate studies in English literature, which culminated in thesis on Shakespeare's King Lear, provided him with rigorous training in literacy theory that have been very helpful in his current work in constitutional interpretation. Now, recently he came out with this amazing article or publication. It's called "Is Your Law School Going Broke? A Field Guide for Interested Parties." Well, Professor Campos, and welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Will.
Well, again, Professor, as I mentioned before, a lot of students today are still very much interested in attending law schools. Again, it's not just a career path. It's more about the personal ambition and drive. And most importantly, as we're looking at this complication of the political and also this constitutional crisis, not only in the States, but around the world. But your article pointed out something so interesting, is the law school going broke. Can you tell us a little bit more? What is happening to the law schools today, and why are some of the law schools are going to be in a financial difficulties or financial hurdles at this moment? Your thoughts?
Yes, and let me just make clear that I'm speaking here of law schools in the United States. I'm not familiar with the economic or political circumstances of law schools in other countries. So in the United States, we have a major financial crisis right now in legal education. And the reasons are multifarious, but a big one is that for about 15 years now, both the number of people attending and the amount of money that they've been willing to pay for tuition has been falling, with the result being that American law schools are pulling in about 40% less money in constant dollars from tuition for the JD degree, the basic law degree in the United States, than they were 15 years ago. And because of that, which has been produced by a number of factors, my analysis concludes that about 40% of the law schools in the United States are in severe financial difficulty, and another 30% are in serious, if not quite as difficult financial circumstances. So the point of the article is really captured in the title, which is to allow people who are interested to take a look at the financial circumstances of essentially every accredited law school in the United States to see how the school is doing, roughly speaking. And as I said, many of them are struggling very badly, and it's a really systemic and structural problem.
Professor Campos, in your article, you actually listed a bunch of different law schools. And for example, I'm looking at the one called the Texas A&M. And this is what you wrote, and it says, "This is the most extreme current example of a university deciding to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into building a putative, prestigious law school. And the school also appeared to be a leader in creating fully online program for various non-JD students." Professor, from your perspective, we understand it's one thing that we continue to strengthen the programs for our students, but it's something else that pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into building this prestigious law school. And of course, Texas A&M is not the only one. Why do you think those schools today are so driven by expanding the programs or looking so good for the programs or even think outside the box? So, of course, there are so many advantages to it. But from your perspective, we want to know, what are the major hurdles in addition to the financial jeopardies? Your thoughts?
My thoughts. Well, in the case of Texas A&M in particular, you have a school that is competing with the University of Texas, which is a very elite research university, and Texas A&M wants to be sort of in the same stratosphere as Texas. And in order to compete with them in terms of legal education, they went and acquired a law school about 15 years ago, a freestanding law school that had existed already in Texas. And they have poured enormous amounts of money into their school to try to make it at least sort of on the fringes of the elite law schools in the United States. And I think my theory in the paper is that a lot of universities have done similar-ish sort of things because they're chasing after institutional prestige, and they believe that a highly ranked law school will bring them this. The difficulty is that theory has a lot of problems in terms of whether it's actually working. And furthermore, with the political situation in the United States, where higher education is coming under a lot of attack from the federal government and the Trump administration, that's a kind of a double effect of you have the economic problems and then you have the political problems. And so a lot of law schools are struggling quite badly right now for essentially structural economic and exogenous political reasons. And it's a very troubling situation.
Professor Campos, I want to get into the politics a little bit since you mentioned that. Again, as you mentioned before, today, a lot of institutions in America are facing tremendous political and also this economic pressure under the Trump administration. Now, of course, that it's one thing that we can't take away the ambitions and drive of the students who really desire to study laws in America and to serve the country. But on the other hand, how do you think that current political atmosphere actually create a lot of pressure for law school, especially when it comes to financial support, when it comes to loans? Because I know in the article you also wrote that law schools face additional challenges produced by the new restriction on federal student loans to graduate and professional school students. Can you unwrap a little bit around that? Thank you.
Yes, a very big change has taken place just in the last year in the structure of federally guaranteed educational loans for graduate and professional programs, such as law schools. Prior to this past year, law schools could charge anything that they wanted, and the federal government would loan whatever amount that might be to a student who wanted to borrow a sum up to the entire cost of attendance. Well, under this new program, you can only borrow a maximum of $50,000 a year and a lifetime total of $200,000 in total from the federal government from these loan programs. And there are many law schools in the United States where the cost of attendance right now is more than $50,000 a year, which of course means that you can't borrow the entire amount of attendance anymore from the federal government. And this is, of course, creating very significant financial challenges for law schools on top of all the other challenges that they're facing. So it's something I mentioned in the article, is that the sort of hostility of the Trump administration to many aspects of higher education is reflected in things like these new relatively stringent restrictions on federal student loans. And so all of these things sort of coalesce together to create what I call a kind of perfect storm of economic distress for many, many law schools.
Another term that you distinctively mentioned in the article is called the Trumpist political movement to intellectual life in general and university life in particular. Professor, I want to ask you to dive into a little deeper on that. What do you mean by intellectual life? Because again, we know that academic success is crucial, especially for anyone who would like to desire for a better job or especially for a promising future. But right now, when we look at the Trumpist political movement, the challenge to intellectual life, it's beyond just what's happening in the classroom. It's beyond what's happening on campus. So from your perspective, especially from the law school aspect, what does that mean when we think about the intellectual life? And also, I know you touch on briefly about artificial intelligence as well. I mean, we know that this is another challenging aspect. The Trump administration correct me if I'm wrong, is about to roll out even harder restriction on artificial intelligence, especially for a lot of educators and a lot of people in the professional field are rather anxious and worried about the future. So, from your perspective, how do you think that this Trumpist political movement is challenging the intellectual life along with the presence and expansion of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, those are two separate but related things. The Trumpist movement in the United States is a classic sort of authoritarian, trending towards fascistic political movement that is hostile to critical intellectual inquiry because fascistic ideologies don't like don't like intellectual inquiry, and so they are. Very predisposed to attack institutions of higher learning in particular. And the Trumpist regime and the Trumpist political movement in the United States, by its nature, is hostile to intellectual inquiry in general. Artificial intelligence ties into all this in complicated ways. But one of the problems that law schools are grappling with right now, as part of just a larger problem of artificial intelligence in higher education, is what kinds of effects are there going to be on the structure and especially the labor delivery structure of higher education, given the effects of AI. And we don't know the answer to that question, but we do know, as you know very well, that AI has been advancing at an extremely rapid rate in the very, very recent past and the present, of course. So the situation has changed really drastically just in 3 or 4 years. And higher education in general and law schools in particular are trying to figure out how to navigate that. So they're navigating both the sort of attacks on higher education for the Trump administration and the tremendous technological challenges and uncertainties that are created by this sudden sort of wave of the new sort of supposedly agentic AI. And so these are all sources of tremendous uncertainty. And of course, uncertainty is something that is, from an economic perspective, undesirable because you can't count on things like your revenue streams going forward because of these uncertain factors. And so all these things are coalescing. They're related, but they're also independent to create a situation of extreme economic uncertainty for American law schools going forward.
Professor Campos, I know you're very busy. I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, towards the end of the publication, this is what you wrote, and I quote, "While it may be plausible to assume that having a genuinely elite law school provides some sort of material benefit to the university that hosts it, the fact remains that law school reputation is remarkably sticky." Oof. Let's talk a little bit more. Professor, from your perspective, what does that mean when we think about the law school reputation? Again, my background is not law school. My background is media, it's journalism. But I know that from a student perspective, when we are looking for specific institutions and we're really looking at the content instead of the form, because we know that what we can learn in the classroom, outside the classroom, is rather critical. But at this moment, again, just looking at what's happening in the US education, the reputation is still standing at the crossroads. So, Professor, from your perspective, what does that mean that the fact is unchangeable, that the school reputation is still remarkably sticky? Since we talk about the Trump administration, we talk about artificial intelligence, and also we talk about the financial jeopardy, how does that tie in together with the reputation?
Well, the irony here is that schools have spent billions of dollars to try to improve their status in the reputational hierarchy in legal education in America. But it just so happens that legal education in America is extraordinarily hierarchical in a way that is extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. I mean, I'll give you a very specific example of this. If you look at the dozen highest ranked law schools in the United States, as those things are sort of measured roughly, right now, they are literally the same 12 highest ranked law schools when I was a student 40 years ago. So in other words, you've had no turnover, certainly between these broad bands of different tiers of status among law schools in the United States. And so, to me, it's very perverse and ironic that this economic crisis has been triggered in no small part by chasing after a kind of prestige shift that is really not available, no matter how much money schools spend, simply because of the way the hierarchy of educational institutions works in the United States, especially in regard to a discipline like law, which is already extremely hierarchical to begin with. So when you combine sort of elite sociology of institutions of higher education in the United States with the elite sociology of the legal profession in the United States, it just makes it really perverse and extraordinarily inefficient to be chasing after a kind of prestige shift that ultimately law schools almost universally cannot actually achieve. And so that I think is the underlying irony at the bottom of my entire analysis, which is all of this money has been spent for essentially no good reason. And now that the money is in short supply, I think people are maybe going to begin to be able to look at this with a critical eye in the way that economic, crisis does create opportunities for people to ask themselves, why have we been spending the money that we've been spending in the way that we've been spending it? So that's kind of the whole sort of thesis and purpose of my paper.
Well, Professor Campos, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Briefly, that you wrote, the sooner law professors, deans, and central administrators let go of the delusion that this incredibly expensive tournament to acquire prestige, it's anything other than a deeply irrational and socially destructive negative sum game. Again, as something that you mentioned before. But another perspective that we have to think about and we have to talk about today is the word sustainability. Because we know that today schools are still worried and anxious about surviving. It's no longer just about growing, it's a survival game first. So, Professor, again, you're the expert. From your perspective, your brief thoughts. How could law school today can be more economically sustainable and also more attractive? It's no longer just about expansion. It's about being practical and feasible. And most importantly, again, students are looking for scholarships. Students are looking for financial, what we say, alleviation at this moment. So I want to hear your final thoughts.
Sure. I think that the path forward for law schools is clear. There is a lot of ways, it's not mysterious, that we could cut operating costs in ways that would not be significantly detrimental to the educational experience of students. As I mentioned in the article, you could go back to the financial structures of a generation ago vis-a-vis American law schools and still have a perfectly adequate and better than adequate legal education, I think, for students, but it would be much more economically sustainable. And I think one other opportunity that's created by this situation is that law schools will have the opportunity, I think, to focus now more clearly and cogently on what is it that we really absolutely need to do as opposed to what we might want to do, given now that we're dealing with a situation of increasingly sharp scarcity. And so, as is often the case in economic affairs, economic pressure creates a kind of opportunity for realism and rethinking and clarity that is much more possible to achieve when you in fact have to figure out a way to pay the bills when the economic structure has changed in a way to create the kind of pressures that we're seeing now. So I see this as a genuine opportunity for legal education in the United States to reform itself in all kinds of healthy sorts of ways. And so there could be a sort of very significant silver lining to this entire economic crisis within the context of the American Legal Academy. So hopefully that will be one consequence of this particular crisis.
And again, Professor, hopefully that your article can serve as a genuine reminder to a lot of decision makers, especially for the higher educations. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Paul Campos. Again, Professor Campos left the position with a Chicago law firm to begin his teaching career at Colorado Law School in 1990s. He is a scholar. He is focused on constitutional law and legal theories. And I strongly encourage everyone to check out this amazing publication, Is Your Law School Going Broke? A Field Guide for Interested Parties. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the legal studies. So thank you so much for doing this.